Midnight. It was raining, abysmally. Not the kind of rain in which people sometimes fondly say they like to walk, but rain that was heavy and pitiless, like the rain that fell in France during the war. The road, unrolling slowly beneath Marvin's headlights, glistened like the flank of a great black snake. Almost Marvin expected it to writhe out from beneath the wheels of his car. Marvin's small coupe was the only man-made thing that moved through the seething night. Within the car, however, it was like a snug little cave. Marvin might almost have been in a theater, unconcernedly watching some somber drama in which he could revel without really being touched. His sensation was almost one of creepiness. It was incredible that he could be so close to the rain and still so warm and dry. He hoped devoutly that he would not have a flat tire on a night like this. Ahead, a tiny red pinpoint appeared at the side of the road, grew swiftly, then faded in the car's glare to the bull's eye of a lantern, swinging in the gloved fist of a big man in a streaming rubber coat. Marvin automatically braked the car and rolled the right-hand window down a little way as he saw the big man come splashing toward him. Bridge washed away, the big man said. "Where are you going, mister?" "Felder's. Damn it. You'll have to go around Little Rock Falls. Take your left up that road. It's a county road, but it's passable. Take your right after you cross Little Rock Falls Bridge. It'll bring you into Felder's." Marvin swore. The trooper's face, black behind the ribbons of water dripping from his hat, laughed. "It's a bad night, mister." "Gosh, yes, isn't it? Well, if he must detour, he must detour. What a night to crawl for miles along a rutty back road." Ruddy had no word for it. Every few feet, Marvin's car plunged into water-filled holes, gouged out from beneath by the settling of the light roadbed. The sharp, cutting sound of loose stone against the tires was audible even above the hiss of the rain. 4 miles, and Marvin's motor began to sputter and cough. Another mile, and it surrendered entirely. The ignition was soaked, the car would not budge. Marvin peered through the moisture-streaked windows, and vaguely, like blacker masses beyond the road, he sensed the presence of thickly clustered trees. The car had stopped in the middle of a little patch of woods. Judas, Marvin thought disgustedly. What a swell place to get stalled. He switched off the lights to save the battery. He saw the glimmer then, through the intervening trees, indistinct in the depths of rain. Where there was a light, there was certainly a house, and perhaps a telephone. Marvin pulled his hat tightly down upon his head, clasped his coat collar up around his ears, got out of the car, pushed the small coupe over on the shoulder of the road, and ran for the light. The house stood perhaps 20 feet back from the road, and the light shone from a front room window. As he plowed through the muddy yard, there was no sidewalk. Marvin noticed a second stalled car, a big sedan standing black and deserted a little way down the road. The rain was beating him, soaking him to the skin. He pounded on the house door like an impatient sheriff. Almost instantly, the door swung open, and Marvin saw a man and a woman standing just inside, in a little hallway that led directly into a well-lighted living room. The hallway itself was quite dark, and the man and woman were standing close together, almost as though they might be endeavoring to hide something behind them. But Marvin, wholly preoccupied with his own plight, failed to observe how unusual it must be for these two rural people to be up and about, fully dressed, long after midnight. Partly shielded from the rain by the little overhang above the door, Marvin took off his dripping hat and urgently explained his plight. "My car won't go. Wire's wet, I guess. I wonder if you'd let me use your phone?" I might be able to get somebody to come out from Little Rock Falls. I'm sorry that I had to." "That's all right," the man said. "Come inside. When you knocked at the door, you startled us. We really hadn't. Well, you know how it is in the middle of the night and all. But come in." "We'll have to think this out differently," John, the woman said suddenly. "Think what's different," thought Marvin absently. Marvin muttered something about you never being too careful about strangers, what with so many hold-ups and all. And oddly, he sensed that in the half-darkness the man and woman smiled briefly at each other, as though they shared some secret that made any conception of physical danger to themselves quietly, mildly amusing. "We weren't thinking of you in that way," the man reassured Marvin. "Come into the living room." The living room of that house was just ordinary. 2 overstuffed chairs, a davenport, a bookcase. Nothing particularly modern about the room. Not elaborate, but adequate. In the brighter light, Marvin looked at his hosts. The man was around 40 years of age, the woman considerably younger, 28 or perhaps 30, and there was something definitely attractive about them. It was not their appearance so much. For in appearance they were merely ordinary people. The woman was almost painfully plain. But they moved and talked with a curious singleness of purpose. They reminded Marvin of a pair of gray doves. Marvin looked around the room until he saw the telephone in a corner, and he noticed with some surprise that it was one of the old-style coffee grinder affairs. The man was watching him with peculiar intentness. "We haven't tried to use the telephone tonight," he told Marvin abruptly, "but I'm afraid it won't work." "I don't see how it can work," the woman added. Marvin took the receiver off the hook and rotated the little crank. No answer from Central. He tried again, several times, but the line remained dead. The man nodded his head slowly. "I didn't think it would work," he said then. "Wires down or something," I suppose Marvin hazarded. "Funny thing, I haven't seen one of those old-style phones in years. Didn't think they used EM anymore." "You're out in the sticks now," the man laughed. He glanced from the window at the almost opaque sheets of rain falling outside. "You might as well stay here a little while. While you're with us, you'll have the illusion, at least, that you're in a comfortable house." What on earth is he talking about, Marvin asked himself. Is he just a little bit off, maybe? That last sounded like nonsense. Suddenly the woman spoke. "He'd better go, John. He can't stay here too long, you know. It would be horrible if someone took his license number and people jumped to conclusions afterward. No one should know that he stopped here." The man looked thoughtfully at Marvin. "Yes, dear, you're right. I hadn't thought that far ahead. I'm afraid, sir, that you'll have to leave," he told Marvin. "Something extremely strange." Marvin bristled angrily and buttoned his coat with an air of affronted dignity. "I'll go," he said shortly. "I realize perfectly that I'm an intruder. You should not have let me in. After you let me in, I began to expect ordinary human courtesy from you. I was mistaken. Good night." The man stopped him. He seemed very earnest. "Just a moment. Don't go until we explain. We have never been considered discourteous before. But tonight. I must introduce myself. I am John Reed, and this is my wife." Gracie paused significantly, as though that explained everything, but Marvin merely shook his head. "My name's Marvin Phelps, but that means nothing to you." "All this talk seems pretty useless," the man coughed nervously. "Please understand. We're only asking you to go for your own good." "Oh, sure," Marvin said. "Sure. I understand perfectly. Good night." The man hesitated. "You see," he said slowly, "things aren't as they seem. We're really ghosts." "You don't say." "My husband is quite right," the woman said loyally. "We've been dead for 21 years. 22 years next October," the man added, after a moment's calculation. "It's been a long time." "Well, I never heard such hooey," Marvin babbled. "Kindly step away from that door, mister, and let me out of here before I swing from the heels." "I know it sounds odd," the man admitted, without moving, "and I hope that you will realize that it's from no choice of mine that I have to explain. Nevertheless, I was electrocuted 21 years ago for the murder of the chairman of the school board over in Little Rock Falls. Notice how my head is shaved. And my split trouser leg? The fact is that whenever we materialize, we have to appear exactly as we were in our last moment of life. It's a restriction on us. Screwy, certainly screwy. And yet Marvin hazily remembered that school board affair. Yes, the murderer had been a fellow named Reed. The wife had committed suicide a few days after the burial of her husband's body. It was such an odd insanity. Why, they both believed it. They even dressed the part. That odd dress the woman was wearing way out of date. And the man's slit trouser leg. The screwy cluck had even shaved a little patch on his head, too. And his shirt was open at the throat. They didn't look dangerous, but you never can tell. Better humor them and get out of here as quick as I can. Marvin cleared his throat. If I were you, why, say I'd have lots of fun materializing. I'd be at it every night. Build up a reputation for myself. The man looked disgusted. I should kick you out of doors. Don't bother with him, John, the wife exclaimed. It's getting late. Mr. Phelps. The self-styled ghost doggedly persisted, ignoring the woman's interruption. Perhaps you noticed a car stalled on the side of the road as you came into our yard. Well, that car, Mr. Phelps, belongs to Lieutenant Governor Lyons of Felders, who prosecuted me for that murder and won a conviction. Although he knew that I was innocent. Of course, he wasn't Lieutenant Governor, then he was only county prosecutor. That was a political murder, and Lyons knew it. But at that time he still had his way in the world, and circumstances pointed toward me. For example, the body of the slain man was found in the ditch just beyond my house. The body had been robbed. The murderer had thrown the victim's pocketbook and watched under our front steps. Lyons said that I had hidden them there, though obviously I'd never have done a suicidal thing like that. Had I really been the murderer. Lyons knew that, too, but he had to burn somebody. What really convicted me was the fact that my contract to teach had not been renewed that spring. It gave Lyons a ready-made motive to pin on me. So he framed me. They tried, sentenced, and electrocuted me, all very neatly and legally. 3 days after I was buried, my wife committed suicide. He was nevertheless beginning to think, what a story to tell the gang. If only they'd believe him. I can't understand, he pointed out slyly, how you can be so free with this house if, as you say, you've been dead 21 years or so. Don't the present owners or occupants object? If I lived here, I certainly wouldn't turn the place over to a couple of ghosts, especially on a night like this. The man answered readily, I told you that things are not as they seem. This house has not been lived in since Grace died. It's not a very modern house anyway, and people have natural prejudices. At this very moment, you are standing in an empty room. Those windows are broken. The wallpaper has peeled away, and half the plaster has fallen off the walls. There is really no light in the house. If things appeared to you as they really are, you could not see your hand in front of your face. Marvin felt in his pocket for his cigarettes. Well, he said, you seem to know all the answers. Have a cigarette, or don't you smoke? The man extended his hand. Thanks, he replied. This is an unexpected pleasure. You'll notice that although there are ashtrays about the room, there are no cigarettes or tobacco. Grace never smoked, and when they cooked me in jail, she brought all my tobacco there to me. Of course, as I pointed out before. You see this room exactly as it was at the time she killed herself. She's wearing the same dress, for example. There's a certain form about these things, you know. Marvin lit the cigarette. Well, he exclaimed. Brother, you certainly seem to think of everything. Though I can't understand, even yet, why you want me to get out of here. I should think that after you've gone to all this trouble, arranging your effects and so on, you'd want somebody to haunt. The woman laughed dryly. Oh, you're not the man we want to haunt, Mr. Phelps. You came along quite by accident. We hadn't counted on you at all. No, Mr. Lyons is the man we're interested in. He's out in the hall now, the man said suddenly. He jerked his head toward the door through which Marvin had come. And all at once, all this didn't seem half so funny to Marvin as it had seemed a moment before. You see. The woman went on quickly. This house of ours is on a back road. Nobody ever travels this way. We've been trying for years to haunt Mr. Lyons, but we've had very little success. He lives in Felder's, and we're pitifully weak when we go to Felder's. We're strongest when we're in this house. Perhaps because we lived here so long. But tonight, when the bridge went out, we knew that our opportunity had arrived. We knew that Mr. Lyons was not in Felder's, and we knew that he would have to take this detour in order to get home. We felt very strongly that Mr. Lyons would be unable to pass this house tonight. It turned out as we had hoped. Mr. Lyons had trouble with his car, exactly as you did, and he came straight to this house to ask if he might use the telephone. Perhaps he had forgotten us. Years ago, 21 years is a long time. Perhaps he was confused by the rain and didn't know exactly where he was. He fainted, Mr. Phelps, the instant he recognized us. We have known for a long time that his heart is weak, and we had hoped that seeing us would frighten him to death, but he is still alive. While he is unconscious, we can do nothing more. Actually, we're almost impalpable. If you weren't so convinced that we are real, you could pass your hand right through us. We decided to wait until Mr. Lyons regained consciousness and then to frighten him again. We even discussed beating him to death with one of those non-existent chairs you think you see. You understand, his body would be unmarked. He would really die of terror. We were still discussing what to do when you came along. We realized at once how embarrassing it might prove for you if Mr. Lyons' body were found in this house tomorrow, and the police learned that you were also in the house. That's why we want you to. Well, Marvin said bluntly, I don't see how I can get my car away from here. It won't run, and if I walk to Little Rock Falls and get somebody to come back here with me, the damage will be done. Yes, the man admitted thoughtfully. It's a problem. For several minutes they stood like a tableau without speaking. Marvin was uneasily wondering, did these people really have old Lyons dead up in the hallway? Were they really planning to murder the man? The big car, standing out beside the road, belonged to somebody. Marvin coughed discreetly. Well, it seems to me, my dear Shades, he said, that unless you are perfectly willing to put me into what might turn out to be a very unpleasant position, You'll have to let your vengeance ride for tonight, anyway. There'll never be another opportunity like this, the man pointed out. That bridge won't go again in 10 lifetimes. We don't want the young man to suffer, though, John. It seems to me Marvin suggested, as though this revenge idea of yours is overdone. Anyway, murdering lions won't really do you any good, you know. It's the customary thing when a wrong has been done, the man protested. Well, maybe, Marvin argued, and all the time he was wondering whether he were really facing a madman who might be dangerous, or whether he were at home dreaming in bed, but I'm not so sure about that. Hauntings are pretty infrequent, you must admit. I'd say that shows that a lot of ghosts really don't care much about the vengeance angle, despite all you say. I think that if you check on it carefully, you'll find that a great many ghosts realize that revenge isn't so much. It's really the thinking about revenge, and the planning of it. That's all the fun. Now, for the sake of argument, what good would it do you to put old lions away? Why, you'd hardly have any incentive to be ghosts anymore. But if you let him go, why, say any time you wanted to, you could start to scheme up a good scare for him, and begin to calculate how it would work. And time would fly like everything. And on top of all that, if anything happened to me on account of tonight, it would be just too bad for you. You'd be haunted, really. It's a bad rule that doesn't work two ways. The woman looked at her husband. He's right, John, she said tremulously. We'd better let lions go. The man nodded. He looked worried. He spoke very stiffly to Marvin. I don't agree entirely with all you've said, he pointed out, but I admit that in order to protect you, we'll have to let lions go. If you'll give me a hand, we'll carry him out and put him in his car. Actually, I suppose I'll be doing all the work. Yes, the man agreed, you will. They went into the little hall, and there, to Marvin's complete astonishment, crumpled on the floor lay old Lyons. Marvin recognized him easily from the newspaper photographs he had seen. Hard-looking duffer. Isn't he, Marvin said, trying to stifle a tremor in his voice. The man nodded without speaking. Together, Marvin, watching the man narrowly, they carried the lax body out through the rain and put it into the big sedan. When the job was done, the man stood silently for a moment, looking up into the black invisible clouds. It's clearing, he said matter-of-factly. In an hour, it'll be over. My wife will kill me when I get home, Marvin said. The man made a little clucking sound. Maybe if you wiped your ignition now, your car's start. It's had a chance to dry a little. I'll try it, Marvin said. He opened the hood and wiped the distributor cap and points in around the spark plugs with his handkerchief. He got in the car and stepped on the starter, and the motor caught almost immediately. The man stepped toward the door, and Marvin doubled his right fist, ready for anything. But then the man stopped. Well, I suppose you'd better be going along, he said. Good night. Good night, Marvin said. And thanks. I'll stop by one of these days and say hello. You wouldn't find us, and the man said simply. By heaven, he is nuts, Marvin thought. Listen, brother, he said earnestly, I'm gone. You aren't going to do anything funny to old Lyons. The other shook his head. No, don't worry. Marvin let in the clutch and stepped on the gas. He wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible. In Little Rock Falls, he went into an all-night lunch and telephoned the police that there was an unconscious man sitting in a car 3 or 4 miles back on the detour. Then he drove home. Early the next morning, on his way to work, he drove back over the detour. He kept watching for the little house, and when it came in sight, he recognized it easily from the contour of the rooms and the spacing of the windows and the little overhang above the door. But as he came closer, he saw that it was deserted. The windows were out, the steps had fallen in, the clapboards were gray and weather-beaten, and naked rafters showed through holes in the roof. Marvin stopped his car and sat there beside the road for a little while, his face oddly pale. Finally, he got out of the car and walked over to the house and went inside. There was not one single stick of furniture in the rooms. Jagged scars showed in the ceilings where the electric fixtures had been torn away. The house had been wrecked years before by vandals, by neglect, by the merciless wearing of the sun and the rain. In shape alone were the hallway and living room as Marvin remembered them. There, he thought, is where the bookcases were. The table was there, the davenport there. Suddenly he stooped and stared at the dusty boards underfoot. On the naked floor lay the butt of a cigarette. And a half-dozen feet away lay another cigarette that had not been smoked, that had not even been lighted. Marvin turned around blindly and, like an automaton, walked out of that house. 3 days later, he read in the newspapers that Lieutenant Governor Lyons was dead. The lieutenant governor had collapsed, the item continued, while driving his own car home from the state capitol the night the Felder's Bridge was washed out. The death was attributed to heart disease. Marvin Phelps knew that, even though his considerate ghostly hosts had voluntarily relinquished their vengeance, nature had meted out justice. And in a strange way he felt glad that was so glad that Grace and John Reed had left fate the punishment they had planned to impose with their own ghostly hands.